segment of our Wednesday show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We're going to conclude today's show with a running back who could be the next Christian McCaffrey over the next decade or so, and that is Breece Hall. Breece Hall is someone who I'm really excited about. He was a player on my fantasy team last year who was one of the highlights of my fantasy team amidst a bunch of lowlights. So, thank you to Breece Hall for last season saving me in some fantasy games. But as a fantasy player, he is certainly no joke. Let's just go over some of his stats if we take a deep dive into him. He has 310.6 fantasy points best year last year. The running back 6 last year. He's just on the precipice of breaking the top 5 in fantasy points per game. 299 touches. A lot of touches. 1,585 yards. And an interesting stat to know in that weeks 5 through 18, he averaged 20.2 touches and 102.5 yards. And also, here's a little tidbit. He led all running backs in targets, receiving yards, and receptions. Anything that Christian McCaffrey does, Breece Hall is kind of his equal if you think about it. He's 3rd in yards per route run, 4th in expected yards per route run, and next year he's projected to have a nice little year for himself. Only 998 yards, not as much as other running backs are expected to have, but still a fantastic season by his standards. 8 TDs, here's where he gets a lot of production, and for you PPR heads out there, pay note to this. 601 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, for a total of 239.7 fantasy points last year. Just to add in as well, he did have 76 catches last year. So in terms of PPR league, he's sitting pretty. He could be a RB1 in at least a PPR league, but unfortunately there are other formats of fantasy football out there. So Breece Hall certainly has to be considered at every single facet of the fantasy football realm. But as of right now, he's making a case for being, at the very least, a top 5 fantasy running back. But here's what gives me pause about Aaron Rodgers coming back into this New York Jets system and how it affects Breece Hall. Breece Hall has the benefit of the doubt in terms of them needing a running back over the past couple of years to sustain at least some modicum of offense, any iota of hope for that offense because of their putrid quarterback play. From what I hear about Aaron Rodgers, they're not expecting him to be as disappointing as Zach Wilson. They fully expect him to be a QB that vaults them into the contender status in the AFC that they so desperately want. And so, Breece Hall might fall by the wayside if they think that Aaron Rodgers can still air the football out. And so, maybe that's why it's reflected in what people think about what his stats will be like next year in terms of his rushing production. But one thing that's a silver lining in all of this is that I don't think his receiving production will go down. In fact, it will go up. I think that Aaron Rodgers will definitely utilize Breece Hall more than people expect in the passing game as kind of a screen action kind of player. And Breece Hall, as we see and know, is a top 10 receiving running back. And so there are some aspects of Breece Hall's game that might fall to the wayside, but there's some that are going to get heavily elevated. Mainly due to what the New York Jets think Aaron Rodgers brings to their system. So I'm not that worried about Breece Hall. What I'm more worried about is the fact that Aaron Rodgers definitely has an agenda to set. Aaron Rodgers can't just come in here and say, oh, I'm going to half-ass it. Aaron Rodgers has to be the Aaron Rodgers the New York Jets expect. And I just don't think that right now the New York Jets have the protection that Aaron Rodgers needs in order to sustain that level of success. That doesn't necessarily matter for Breece Hall, but if you're a player in the backfield, whether you're a quarterback or a running back, you want to rely on your offensive line. Breece Hall, what with the pieces he had in his offensive line last year, did a remarkable job in how many yards he got and what he did as a fantasy running back. But still, that's the shakiest part of the Jets' offense that really wants to take off. And so, Breece Hall and Aaron Rodgers both face the challenge of both being in the backfield, both having to communicate with the offensive line, and both players kind of carrying the burden of the Jets' offense. Another worrying thing is that while it might not be the case for other running backs because other running backs get a lot more touches, Breece Hall doesn't necessarily have another guy behind him that can really step into his shoes. Israel Abanikanda isn't there just yet. He just came off a rookie season. I just don't see how any other running back in the Jets system can do what Breece Hall can do, and that ultimately puts a lot of pressure on him to deliver. And he also had a ACL injury early in his career that took him out for a whole season. So it all comes down to if Breece Hall and Aaron Rodgers find a way to fit together and find a way to overcome any challenges they might foresee in what they do in their system. So I also think that Breece Hall is going to have a slow start, much like Aaron Rodgers will, mainly due to the fact that they are going to work out the kinks. My last worry for Breece Hall is the fact that the Jets want to get their wide receivers going. Obviously, Garrett Wilson has performed very well, remarkably well for the quarterback play he's gotten over the years. But with Aaron Rodgers, he certainly wants to make a good impression on him because, as we all know, Aaron Rodgers and wide receivers, when they mix, they are either liked and esteemed by Aaron Rodgers or they can fall to the wayside. We saw it with Allen Lazard. He's the reason why Aaron Rodgers is here as well. So the receivers are also going to be a huge part as to what affects Breece Hall the most because of the fact that it's out of his hands in terms of how Aaron Rodgers views his receivers. Breece Hall doesn't necessarily fit in that conversation. Breece Hall's job as a running back in the Jets system seems to be the guy that alleviates some of the pressure on Aaron Rodgers, and thus a lot of pressure might fall on his shoulders. In fact, I don't necessarily think Aaron Rodgers is going to come under as much pressure as Breece Hall, because if Breece Hall doesn't deliver, that means that the only form of offense is Aaron Rodgers to the air, and Aaron Rodgers to the air might result in the offensive line breaking down, and then that whole cycle could happen again. So, talking about a running back like Breece Hall, in a market like New York, with a teammate like Aaron Rodgers, with a skill position core that really wants to step up for Aaron Rodgers, I'm talking about a dangerous kind of cliff to stare down here, I think, because of the fact that Breece Hall, he's right there in terms of fantasy stats. He's at the precipice of being one of the top 5 fantasy running backs right now. But that was a different New York Jets team than what he's stepping into this year. Zach Wilson can fail as much, and he can fall back as much on Breece Hall as he wants. Aaron Rodgers can't quite do the same. Robert Saleh signed Aaron Rodgers because of the fact he wanted a more grounded passing attack. He wanted a guy who can come in here, has the experience, has the know-how to get the most out of his skill position core. And looking at Breece Hall got the most out of a stable QB's absence. I'm not saying the same things can't happen under Aaron Rodgers, but let's say you're in Breece Hall's shoes. Would you rather Zach Wilson rely on you both as a receiving running back and as a rusher out of the backfield? Or would you rely on a guy like Aaron Rodgers who, while necessarily experienced, certainly will have the whole weight of the world on his shoulders, the whole weight of New York on his shoulders, to make this passing attack something the Jets haven't seen in quite some time? And that's the fine line that Breece Hall represents here. Breece Hall is the bridge between whether or not Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson, and guys like Allen Lazard have good fantasy seasons, or if Breece Hall has a good fantasy season. Breece Hall is the barrier between what the Jets can be, not just in real life, but in fantasy. Because I can sit here and say that Breece Hall is going to put up the projected stats. I can say that Breece Hall offers Aaron Rodgers the biggest security blanket out of any of the New York Jets just for what he does. But I also have to consider the fact that Aaron Rodgers is who he is because of the fact he's been there and done that. And Breece Hall can't say the same. So Aaron Rodgers and Breece Hall's rapport is certainly going to come under question as soon as they step on a football field together. Because Aaron Rodgers, perhaps even in the first play of the game, he's looking deep. He's looking for guys like Garrett Wilson. He's looking to connect with Allen Lazard again. He's not looking for Breece Hall out of the backfield. He's looking to come out swinging. And so, who knows if Breece Hall will demand more touches because of what happens. Who knows if there's going to be a rift in the New York Jets locker room should someone feel as if the wealth isn't getting spread around fairly enough. And so, it's certainly a storyline to watch. But that being said, Breece Hall is certainly a coming. I certainly think that he has the attributes and traits to become a running back, a force to be reckoned with in fantasy, someone who you pick in either the late or early first round of a fantasy draft. But I also have to consider the system he's in and where he's at in his career. I don't necessarily think he has the say in how Aaron Rodgers plays and how Robert Saleh wants Aaron Rodgers to play especially. If Breece Hall was a senior player in this situation, I would say he has the dominant force to come out and say, hey, I want touches. But right now, I don't know where his touches will most likely come from, mainly due to the Aaron Rodgers size conundrum the Jets have on their hands. But that will just about do it for today's show. I hope you guys liked it. We are going to have another fantastic show tomorrow with even more player profiles. In fact, a full show of player profiles will be ahead for you guys tomorrow. I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Consider leaving a tip, donation, or question at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to ultimately the network, but also me and my fellow podcasters. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Like I said, tomorrow should be another can't-miss show. I've been so happy starting this player profile series so you guys get to know a little bit more about each and every player that you can roster on your fantasy team. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be back tomorrow, bigger and better than ever.